Welcome to the Zoology Podcast for December. This podcast has been going for a whole year now, and in light of the festive season, I thought we could cover an animal both synonymous with the cold and a topic I find personally interesting. So on this episode, we are going to be discussing the apex predator that is the polar bear, where they live, how they survive, and if they can continue to endure in their changing Arctic home. Now, the Arctic is a cold polar region located in the northernmost part of the Earth, comprising the Arctic Ocean, its numerous adjacent seas, and the various northern landmasses of Alaska, Canada, Finland, most of Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Russia and Sweden. The land consists mostly of treeless permafrost areas of tundra, while the ocean and seas vary between open water, snow and ice habitats, depending on the location and the season. The Arctic normally has very long and cold winters, averaging around minus 40 degrees Celsius, which is very cold. Although it has been known to dip to nearly minus 70 degrees Celsius. So a wee bit frosty. Which, honestly, is actually not that surprising, considering that during the winter months of November through to February, the sun remains very low in the sky or does not raise at all, depending on where you are latitudinally. And the summer there tends to have much cloud cover, which reduces the amount of sunlight being able to get to the surface and therefore can reduce the temperatures. And this results in the summers being short and classified as cool summers. The most southerly parts tend to average at around 10 degrees Celsius, which is fairly warm, while the North Pole is actually kept warmer than you might think at around minus 2 degrees Celsius. Which is still cold, don't get me wrong, but it's cold enough to keep parts of the Arctic ice frozen all year round. But it's actually the oceanic influences that keep the region warmer than, say, many inland areas. For instance, the interior of Greenland tends to be consistently a few degrees colder than the Arctic interior, because Greenland's interior is not warmed as much by the surrounding ocean currents. Now, the Arctic's cool summers lends itself to seasonally varying snow and ice cover. Most areas of the Arctic receive less than 20 inches of snow a year, which I personally find quite surprising. Although it does experience high winds, which can give the illusion that it's snowing more than it actually does. Although, obviously, if the UK, say we got 5 inches of snow, let alone 20, we would be completely shut down. But anywho, the funny thing about the Arctic is that it's actually named after the polar bear. Arctic means near the bear. But this also means that the Antarctic is named after the polar bear, meaning opposite to near the bear, which is obviously far from the bear. So that's quite funny. But what is it about polar bears that inspire two whole regions of the Earth to be named after them? Well, for starters, they are the largest living bear species. Most males are recorded between 7 foot 10 inches to 9 foot 10 inches tall, while standing on their hind legs, and weigh between 350 to 700 kilograms. But the tallest bear was over 11 foot tall, 11 foot 1 inch, and weighed 1,002 kilograms. Now that's a really, really big bear. I mean, that's almost like, imagine a full-grown man standing on another full-grown man's shoulders. That's really tall. And the female bears tend to be not quite as tall. They tend to be about half the size of the males. Yet most are still over 6 foot tall. So I think it's to say that when compared to human, these bears are absolutely massive. And what's even scarier is that the polar bears are known man-killers, being the most carnivorous member of the bear family, having very little contact and thus fear of humans and needing to consume all available food. It's no wonder that these bears have been known to hunt, eat, and place fear in the hearts of men. The good thing, however, is that most polar bears still tend to be cautious around humans, and will more readily run away from a confrontation than confront humans directly. But equally, polar bears don't tend to become desperate enough to warrant hunting humans, because they are exceedingly well adapted to survive in their Arctic environment. They have a hearing that is comparable to humans, while they have good long-distance vision, yet it is their truly exceptionally evolved sense of smell that is used for hunting. Polar bears are able to smell a seal from 1 mile away, even if they are buried under a metre of snow. Now that's just amazing. And kind of terrifying, because coming along with such an excellent olfactory sense is 42 teeth that reflect the polar bear's highly carnivorous diet. Now compared to a brown bear, their teeth are smaller and sharper, while their canine teeth are distinctly larger and sharper. And this aids the polar bear in hunting the millions of seals which make the Arctic their home, and comprise the majority of the polar bear's diet. Although polar bears are known to hunt walrus, muskox, animals as large as narwhals, and even sometimes other polar bears when times are desperate. Now, you're not going to have the chance to hunt in an environment in which on average experiences minus 40-degree winters without being able to conserve heat effectively. Well, polar bears have evolved to become experts in remaining warm in the cold. They have up to 10 centimeters of fatty adipose tissue under their skin to keep them warm, and their skin is black, which has evolved to better facilitate taking warmth from the sun's rays. Well, now you might be thinking, black skin, but polar bears are white. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but that's not exactly right either. From their skin, polar bears sprout 2 layers of fur, a dense underfur which effectively traps heat, and an outer layer of guard hairs which appear white but are actually transparent and hollow. The air in the hollow hair helps with conserving heat, while the transparency basically scatters light particles. It's these particles, when scattered, that give off a whitish light, and it's this process which gives the polar bears their colour and their ability to camouflage into the snowy environment. In order to conserve heat, polar bears have evolved short, stubby appendages, from little cute bear ears to the smallest tail of any bear species. This evolution of small appendages means the bears have less surface area in which to lose heat, and is common among all warm-blooded northern animals. This phenomenon is often called Allen's Rule, after the American zoologist Joel Asaph Allen in 1877. Now, an interesting exception to this rule is that the polar bear's feet are very, very large, averaging 30 centimeters across the palm. Their feet are vital in transportation and acquiring food. Therefore, the evolutionary pressures to evolve large, powerful paws have overpowered the need to conserve heat through reduced surface area. This can be seen on the pad of each paw, which is covered in small dermal bumps that increase the polar bear's ability to grip the ice as it walks over it. This allows them to walk at an average speed of 3.5 miles per hour, but they can run up to 25 miles an hour. So good luck outrunning them. And even their claws are scooped on the underside, which makes them more easily be able to dig through the ice. So, I don't think igloos are going to give you much protection. Now, the polar bears have an elongated body and longer skull when compared to brown bears. When you couple this with its large paws, this makes the bears actually excellent swimmers, capable of swimming for days at a time. It was even recorded that one female polar bear managed to continuously swim for up to 9 days, covering over 400 miles. And while this length of travel is rare, polar bears have been known to swim the 750 miles from Greenland to Iceland. Although, due to their threatening nature, when these bears arrive on Iceland, they tend to be shot. However, it just goes to show that when you consider their ability to swim such an immense distance and their natural hunting habitat being on ice, makes it not really surprising that polar bears are classified as marine mammals, and even that their scientific name is Ursus maritimus, meaning maritime bear. Now, there are currently 19 generally recognised subpopulations of polar bears, split between 13 North American subpopulations ranging from the Beaufort Sea, across the Hudson Bay, and east to Baffin Island by western Greenland. These populations account for around 54% of the global population, while the Eurasian population comprises 7 subpopulations and extends from Svalbard, a Norwegian archipelago east of Greenland, all the way across northern Russia to the Beaufort Sea. Now, you'd think that these populations might be isolated, although genetic evidence reveals that these populations are not. Polar bears are not territorial animals and will readily roam the rims of the polar ice pack looking for food, so it's not surprising that different populations tend to meet and reproduce. Overall, the global population of polar bears are actually relatively poorly studied, despite being such a focal animal for the climate change awareness campaigns. This lack of study makes it difficult to determine the current global polar bear population, but as of 2017, of the 19 subpopulations, 1 is classified as in decline, 2 are increasing, and 7 are stable, which means we have insufficient data for the other 9 remaining populations. While this does allow the IUCN to place the polar bear on their red list as vulnerable, because they expect global populations to experience a decrease of over 30% within the next 3 generations, that's around 35 years. They tend to cite this basis on concerns over future extent of quality habitat. However, human conflict, pollution, and climate change are all included as well. So let's talk about what we think are the key threats that affect the polar bear's ability to survive. Let's start with hunting. The Arctic, being a harsh environment, requires the people who live there to utilise all available resources just to survive. The environmental pressure has resulted in people of the Arctic having a long tradition of hunting polar bears. This is because polar bear fur is used to make clothing to keep warm in the cold, while footwear is used to keep steady on the ice. The polar bear meat is actually edible, despite its risk of parasites. However, the polar bear's liver is not really edible. Due to them being at the top of the food chain, they tend to concentrate vitamin A within their diet, and this is stored within the liver. This means if you eat the liver, you're basically going to get too much vitamin A in your diet all at once, and this will lead to death. I remember a story once of 2 Arctic explorers who shot a polar bear, ended up eating its meat and ended up eating its liver, and it was eating the liver that killed them. So yeah, if you ever have to survive in the Arctic and you have to eat a polar bear, do not eat the liver. But you can eat the fat, and you can also use the fat as a fuel to heat your home. Or you can use the bear's sinew to make good thread for sewing. So the bear overall is actually really handy to have for the native Arctic people. But this utility also means that they're hunted. So how much is hunting hurting the polar bear's chance of survival? Well, estimates of total historical harvests suggest that from the beginning of the 18th century, approximately 400 to 500 polar bears were being harvested annually across northern Eurasia, peaking at around 1,300 to 1,500 bears in the early 20th century. The Norwegians even designed a trap known as a self-killing gun. Now, it comprised a loaded rifle in a baited box that was placed at the level of a bear's head with a string attached to some bait. So when the bear bit the bait and pulled, the gun would go off, bang, shooting the bear in the head. Now, obviously this is a pretty cruel way to hunt, but it did allow the Norwegians to contribute to the taking of around 1,250 bears in 1968. Now, in the mid-1950s, the concern over polar bear exploitation resulted in the development of national regulations on polar bear hunting, starting with the Soviet Union banning all polar bear hunting in 1956. Norway then began tightening regulations in 1965, while Canada began imposing hunting quotas in 1968. The United States began regulating hunting in 1971 and increased polar bear protection under their Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972, which banned hunting except by subsistence hunters and banned the importation of polar bear pelts and the harassment of polar bears themselves in the wild. Then in 1973, an international agreement on the conservation of polar bears was signed by Canada, Denmark, Norway, the Soviet Union and the United States. The member countries all agreed to place restrictions on recreational and commercial hunting, ban hunting from aircrafts and icebreakers, and conduct further research. This treaty, however, still allowed hunting of the polar bears by local people using traditional methods. However, Norway completely banned the hunting of polar bears as the population of Svalbard was dwindling to only around 1,000 bears left. Now, after the treaty was implemented, the global population of polar bears began to recover to such an extent that in 2006, Greenland allowed the hunting of up to 150 bears annually, or in 2013, the Baffin region of Canada allowed the hunting of 65 bears a year, and the Northwestern Territories allowed up to 103 bears. The United States has proposed to the other countries that the polar bear be placed in the Appendix 1 of CITES. This would effectively ban all international trade of polar bear parts, but this is yet to actually happen. So now that we have an understanding that the hunting of polar bears is under control to such an extent that small-scale hunting is feasible again, what is the next threat to the remaining polar bears? Well, that threat comes in the form of pollution. So polar bears, being apex predators, are at the very tippy top of their food chain. And while you would think it's good for them, it does have its downsides. And a key downside is that their diet accumulates pollutants. So I want you to do this. Imagine an ecological pyramid. At the very bottom is, say, plant life and algae. Now, during the development, say these plants and algae absorb small amounts of pollutants. Well, these plants are then often eaten by small animals on the tier above them in the scale. And this then begins to concentrate the pollutants up the ecological pyramid. So you get the plants that have a little, then the animals that eat them that have a little bit more, then the animals that eat them have a bit more, and then it just exponentially condenses until you get to the very top. And now at the top of our ecological pyramid is the polar bear. So this means that these polar bears are accumulating large quantities of pollutants in their diet. And these pollutants range from PCBs, which are polychlorinated biphenyls. They also accumulate many types of pesticides and halocarbons. Now this is a problem, because PCBs such as flame retardants have been linked to genital birth defects in polar bears, while halocarbons mimic hormone chemistry and can result in a compromised immune system. You see why this is bad news, because for polar bears to keep surviving, they need to have functional genitalia from which the next generation can be produced, and these generations have to be able to cope with all the pathological and environmental conditions which will be thrown their way. Now honestly, I think that this threat is only going to get worse, because the Arctic is increasingly becoming open to humanity, especially with the extraction of an estimated 90 billion barrels of recoverable oil and 44 billion barrels of natural gas. Now, the extraction of these energy resources will result in increased amounts of pollutant in the Arctic, and due to the pollutant accumulation up the ecological pyramid, polar bears will become ever more exposed to unhealthy amounts of these pollutants, and this is obviously eventually going to result in worse health outcomes for the bears in the long term. And that's not even to mention the inevitable accidents that will take place during the extraction of these resources. Any oil spills in the Arctic could be extremely detrimental to any polar bears exposed, because these polar bears rely on their fur for insulation, and soiling their fur reduces its insulative value, putting the bears at risk of hypothermia. But then they might not even get the chance to die of this hypothermia, because we know that bears that are exposed to oil tend to clean their fur using their tongue, which ingests oil into their body, and this oil then causes their kidneys to fail. So overall, while hunting may not be much of a threat to the future of the survival of the polar bear, the increased environmental pollution seen at all ecological levels possesses a far greater threat to the ability of the polar bear to survive within its ecological niche. Therefore, I think we should really aim to reduce the amount of pollutants within their environment as much as humanly possible. But that's all well and good, you might say, but what's the point of reducing pollutants in their environment if, as say, some doctors like Peter Molnár and others are modelling that only high Arctic polar bears will see the year 2100, because the environment in which they are surviving is changing? Well, let's move on to the most debated, complex and intimidating issue of our time, that of climate change. A change in climate will result in a change in the habitats of the Arctic. Now this is an issue because polar bears rely on platforms of sea ice in order to hunt seals, and rising temperatures cause the sea ice to melt earlier in the year. This means polar bears have a reduced period of time to build up their fat stores for the summer and autumn. This reduction in sea ice also causes polar bears to have to swim more between ice platforms, and this is costly in both movement energy and thermal energy. This will eventually lead to more polar bears drowning despite their capacity to swim amazing distances. And even when the bears do reach the ice, warmer weather means the ice will be thinner and less able to take the bear's weight, which will make it more difficult for the bears to acquire seals. However, thinner ice will also allow seals access to currently inaccessible areas where the ice is too thick for them to produce breathing holes. So perhaps the current range of the polar bears will change as the climate does, but it potentially might not significantly affect their numbers. Although, if the bears are finding it harder to acquire food, then this will present itself as a lower reproductive rate in adult females and lower survival rate in cubs and juveniles. So overall, less food means increased hardship for all polar bears. Where would you first look to find these conditions? Well, these conditions are currently being experienced by the most southerly polar bears, although these populations do tend to be the most well studied, so it's hard to extrapolate their struggles to their more northern brothers. However, we know that the population that live in the western Hudson Bay are experiencing ice breakup 3 weeks earlier on average than they did 30 years ago, which obviously reduces the polar bears living there the opportunity to hunt for the required 45 seals they need per year to survive. As a result, the bears of this region were recorded as 50 kilograms lighter in the early 2000s than they were in the 1980s. It's not surprising therefore that the western Hudson Bay subpopulation has declined by 22% since the 80s. But in good news, it has been listed as stable since 2017. In addition to creating nutritional stress, a warmer Arctic is causing changes in annual sea ice, and that is affecting the ability of pregnant female bears to build suitable maternity dens. This has been seen in Alaska, where the sea ice shrinkage has resulted in females changing their denning locations. In 1985, 62% of Alaskan female polar bears built their dens on the sea ice, but by 2004 that had reduced to only 37% of females. So now the Alaskan population resembles the rest of the world's polar bear population, in that it is now more likely to den on land than on the ice. And this isn't surprising, seeing as there is a couple million square kilometres of sea ice lost between the summer sea ice extent of the Beaufort Sea between 1981 and 2021. This also means that the Beaufort Sea bears are having to walk greater distances from their land dens to get to the sea, and then are having to swim longer distances to find sea ice, even during the winter months. And this increases the bear's likelihood of drowning and of being preyed upon by orcas. Now, with polar bears having to spend more time on land and in a warmer environment, they may be forced to rely more on terrestrial food sources such as bird eggs and reindeer. This, however, will drive these polar bears into conflict with brown bears and humans, while also increasing their chances to contract pathogens such as bacterial and parasitical infections. This is thought to be happening already in northern Russia, around the Chukchi Sea, where during the southern months polar bears are being recorded as further inland, and on average spend 30 days more now on land than they did in 1986. While this sounds bad, you should keep in mind that many polar bear populations are understudied, so the trends we see in the more studied populations of southern Canada and Alaska might not hold for the rest of the populations. It's wise to remember that as the climate changes, different subpopulations will face different challenges. While most populations will be negatively hit by a reduction in sea ice leading to hunting difficulties, some populations will benefit from thinner sea ice because it will then become accessible to seals. However, we really do need more research into what is happening within each subpopulation, because this will aid us immensely in our conservation efforts. Modern conservation efforts have been partly fueled by our worries of polar bear extinction. For example, Stephen Amstrup of the US Geological Survey and the chief scientist for Polar Bears International stated that by 2050, 2/3 of all polar bears could be dead due to the shrinking sea ice caused by climate change. However, most predictions from which warnings like this are made are based on mathematical models of the environment. Now, obviously, the processes within the environment are extremely complex, so it's no wonder that these models tend to be more wrong than they are right. You've got to remember that it's humans doing these models, not some type of god. Though we don't have all the variables, and we don't know completely to what extent each variable will have to play off against other variables, so it is incredibly complicated. However, current worldwide population estimates have increased over the past 50 years and are relatively stable today, with an estimated 20 to 30,000 polar bears existing in the wild. But does this mean that these populations are actually healthy, or even that this estimate is correct? Well, from the 1950s and 1960s, population estimates were actually based on accounts from hunters and explorers, and that's obviously not going to give you a very accurate estimate. Good news is, currently we use more accurate scientific methods, such as conducting actual population surveys, so it's no wonder that the population derived from comparing these two methods has seen a modern day increase. It's also important to remember that during this time, in which we started to use more modern methods, hunting was banned or heavily restricted, and this again allows for the population to recover and increase. So it's complicated, because using models with crappy data that are peppered by human intervention isn't really going to help us make accurate predictions for the future, especially not when we don't know all the variables involved. With this in mind, what is next? How do we actively conserve such a magnificent animal during a time of climate change? Well, personally, I believe first we can't conserve that which we don't know. So we need to get accurate data on the amount of individuals within each subpopulation. After this, so that we can then rank each population by extinction risk, paying special attention to likely environmental change, trophic change, pollution, human activity, and polar bear reproduction rate. Then after this, the hard choices have to be made. Do you focus on saving the populations in the south that are going to be more quickly and strongly affected by environmental change? Or do you leave these populations to their fate and focus on perhaps the potentially longer lasting northern populations? And then what can people actually do? Because without a global push to stop pumping out carbon and instead build carbon sinks, the climate will continue to change at a greater rate than if there was no anthropogenic influence at all. Well, it's a really hard issue, because unlike forests or grasslands, you're trying to conserve sea ice, which advances and recedes annually. It's not going to be exactly easy to conserve, and what's even worse is it's reliant on global ecological forces. Although I think there are some solid things we can do. A key one is keeping the hunting of polar bears low as to not crash their populations, and this should in turn keep their food sources from not crashing also. Then I think the next thing to do is keep the Arctic from becoming polluted, This means greatly limiting the exploitation of oil and natural gas in the region, and other human activities. And then after this, I think all we can really do is continue to monitor the polar bears population, their prey population, and the condition of the sea ice. And then just hope. Hope that the remaining polar bears are placid enough to adapt to how the Arctic will change in their coming future.